We continue to follow that breaking news on that deadly plane crash in Kazakhstan. Today, Russian President Vladimir Putin is apologizing for what he calls a tragic incident following the crash of that Azerbaijani airliner that killed 38 people on Christmas Day. But the Kremlin leader is also stopping short of admitting responsibility for the disaster. This comes as a U.S. official tells CNN that Russian air defenses may have mistaken the commercial jet that crashed on Wednesday with a Ukrainian drone. Today, Putin admitted that Russia's air defense systems were active when that flight attempted to land in Chechnya on Wednesday. Let's get to CNN's Nada Bashir, who is covering this for us. Nada, what's the latest here? What are you learning?
That's right. Well, this continues to be a key line of inquiry, whether or not the plane was targeted by Russian anti-aircraft systems operating in the area. Now, we've been hearing, of course, from Azerbaijani officials who confirmed yesterday that they believe that the plane had faced external physical and technical interference. So that was something that they were, and investigators were looking at. But of course, as you mentioned, we have today heard from the Russian President Vladimir Putin, who spoke with his Azerbaijani counterpart and also expressed apologies and condolences for the fact that the plane had crashed and impacted and was facing troubles as it entered Russian airspace. Of course, the crashed in the Kazakh city of Aktau. And now, of course, as you mentioned, Putin stopped short of admitting any sort of responsibility for that, but did acknowledge that Russian air defense systems were operating at the time. And of course, we've been hearing from US officials as well as weapons and aviation experts who have suggested that the holes and perforations that can be seen in the wreckage of the plane in the fuselage would suggest potentially shrapnel damage as a result of an explosion. So that will be something that investigators are looking at. Now, the Kazakh government has set up a commission essentially tasked with carrying out this investigation. They will be looking at all the evidence at hand. We know, of course, that 2 black boxes have been recovered, which will provide investigators with information regarding the flight data as well as potentially internal recordings from within the cockpit. And remarkably, of course, we do have first-hand accounts, video recordings from some of those passengers who survived. At least 29 people survived that crash out of 67 people on board. Some are still said to be in a serious but stable condition, but we've been hearing from some of those survivors, some of whom recorded those final moments, describing hearing a loud bang, that the plane had been behaving unusually in the moments ahead of the crash, that passengers were sent up and down in their seats. So truly terrifying final moments for those passengers and for those who survived. The Kazakh government now issuing compensation both for survivors and the family members of the victims of this crash. But again, still a lot of questions as to what exactly led to that crash. There have been no final conclusions just yet, and authorities say it could take around 2 weeks to fully assess the data recorded in those black boxes. Rahel?
Nada Bashir reporting for us there. Nada, thank you. And joining me now to talk more about these developments is Kim Dozier. She is a CNN Global Affairs analyst. Kim, good to have you. So just top line, what do you make of Putin's apology for this, quote, tragic incident happening in Russian airspace, but not admitting any responsibility?
I don't think we would be hearing that apology unless there'd been so much evidence left and people left alive from the crash. In other words, too much evidence to ignore or deny, which is what Moscow did back in 2014 when the Malaysian Flight 17 was brought down by Russian irregular forces and a Buk missile. This time, you've got 2 black boxes, you've got the voice recordings, you've got all of this human intelligence. Also in that statement, though, laying out Putin's apology to his Azeri counterpart, you had mention that Putin is setting up here is the blame Ukraine for its aggression defense. In other words, Ukraine was attempting to attack an area where a civilian airliner was trying to land, and therefore, in tragic circumstances, Russian air defenses brought it down. I think that's what we're going to see in the coming days.
Yeah, it's interesting that you brought up MH17. I'm curious, our CNN's Nathan Hodge, a former Moscow bureau chief, he wrote a piece for CNN.com. And he talked about how Kremlin disinformation could hide the cause of the crash. Russian state media, for example, making no mention of the possibility that this airliner was shot down. You yourself, Kim, have just said that there is so much evidence here. There's so much video evidence. Do you think moving forward that Russia reasonably can keep a lid on it, or would you expect a more forthright apology coming from Moscow, depending on what we learn?
I think you'll see Putin apologizing directly to his Azeri counterpart, because that's the same thing that Azerbaijan did back in 2020 when it accidentally downed a Russian military helicopter. But the larger point surely will be made that if not for Ukrainian action, this wouldn't have been necessary. Back when the Malaysian flight went down, what Moscow did instead in that case was to flood the zone with conflicting information, multiple different narratives, until people were just confused by everything out there. Ultimately, a Hague court did convict in absentia 2 Russians and a Ukrainian Russian sympathizer for that downing. This time, I think we're going to see this just blamed on tragic circumstances and Kyiv.
Okay. And I'm curious, as you mentioned, the MH17 verdict, I mean, that ultimately took years to get there. I mean, would you expect some sort of similar conclusion here? Or to your point, I mean, do we sort of avoid that altogether and it's either blamed on Ukraine or blamed on tragic circumstances, but it doesn't go the way of sort of legal accountability or criminal accountability?
Well, Russia is on the main investigation body that Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan have set up to look into this crash. So in a sense, it could put its thumb on the scale. But once you've come up with a cause that isn't Russia's fault, then why obfuscate? I think what it'll become is part of just the larger narrative that Russia has tried to spin of itself as a victim, a narrative that somewhat worked with incoming Trump officials, that if NATO hadn't been encroaching, then Russia never would have had to invade Ukraine. But you've got another part of the Trump administration that thinks that Russia has been trying to put out this kind of disinformation for a while and that its aggression needs to be checked. So it'll be interesting to see how this plane crash plays out in that warring narrative when the Trump administration takes office.
Yeah. Kim Dozier, always appreciate your insights in helping us understand the events of the day. Thank you.
Thanks.